So if I'm pulling both sides, that's as strong as it was, or probably stronger than the original. Simple as that. Hello, this is BJ from Hearns Hobbies, and today I'm going to have a little tutorial about soldering. Now, soldering is something that we've touched on before, and it's not often used in model building, but there are certain circumstances where you'll need it, particularly in radio control and some of the areas in scale modeling where you might use lighting. Then of course trains use some soldering as well. So I've got a few different things here which I'm going to go through just to give you a little idea on the best method for soldering, what the different techniques are for getting the best joints, and then a few other miscellaneous tools that you use as well. Okay, so just to start off with, let's go with some wire, because you'll need some wire and you probably want to join wire. So I've got some really thin wire which is commonly used for train layouts. I've got a medium type wire which has actually come from a radio control brushless motor. Then here's a heavier gauge wire which has come off a plug for a charger. So with the different thicknesses, they'll need different types of techniques. So the thinner ones tend to be easier to solder because there's less material, but you have to be careful because if you overheat you can melt all the insulation. Then you got your medium type one, obviously that's going to need a little bit more heat, and then you've got the thicker one which will need more heat and more solder as well. So I'll show you the differences between all of those with some examples. Now to go through some of the basic tools, well of course you'll need a soldering iron. So this particular soldering iron we have here has got adjustable heat, but you could use any hobby type soldering iron. Obviously the really cheap 15 watt ones won't do much more than say the medium gauge wire. And then if you get up to doing thicker wire, you'll probably need something like an 80 watter, which is like this one. And then of course I've got some solder. So this is the most common type of solder. It's got the resin core flux. So we don't need to use any separate flux on these at all. So if you do go and buy yourself some solder, this is the most common solder, but occasionally you might mix it up and get solder alone. That'll be very difficult to solder without separate flux. But this is all in one. And then I've got a heat gun here because we'll be using that for shrinking the heat shrink, for doing the covering up all the joints. I've got some side cutters, heavy duty side cutters, just for cutting through chunky wire. I've got sharp scalpel, so that's for clearing off the insulation from the area we want to join. I've got some needle nose pliers for holding the wire, just so you don't burn yourself, because the heat will travel through the wire pretty quickly. I've got a little support there for a plug, so I'll do a little demo on a plug later, and then I've got some heat shrink here which I'll be using for covering it up. Okay, let's start with the thin wire. So just so you got this wire here, and you've got two separate bits, and you want to join them together. So let's see, the easiest way would be just imagine this. So I'll just chop it in. Okay, so you've got two wires here and we want to join them back up. So first thing we want to do is take off the insulation. Okay, so use a sharp knife, use a little bit of pressure so that you don't cut all the way through, and you just gently roll it like this. And if you bend it, you see that it's already cracked open. And then you just grab it and just pull it off. Okay, so there's your bit of insulation, and then there you see your bare wire. Okay, so we'll do the same thing. I'm just twisting the wires here so that they'll be nice and tight. So there's one already prepared, and we'll just get this one ready. So we're doing the same thing. Light pressure, just roll it. So that's scored the insulation. Let's put that over there. Crack it. Then that'll come off. Okay, so you see how it's a bit bent, we'll just straighten it up. Okay, so we've got our two bits here and we want to join them together. Now, when you want to join, you don't actually want to join face to face like this. You won't get very much strength because it's got to do with surface area. Now, the best way to get surface area is actually do it across here. So you notice that I've got, it's probably about 4 or 5 mils that I've trimmed off there. So that's already around about 3 or 4 times the surface area of just doing the tips. So if you do that, that would be the best way to join it. Okay, so first thing you've got to do is you need to tin these ends. So tinning is basically putting a amount of solder on them first before you join them. So let's just go over here. Now, over here I've got my little cleaner. So this one's actually the sort of metallic type one. So when you put the tip in there, It cleans off all the loose solder. You can get ones which is just a sponge and you just put some water on the sponge. It does exactly the same thing. So just make sure it's clean. And then we'll get our solder here. So let's just unravel a bit. And basically, we just want to tin the end. So you get your soldering iron tip here, so you can see how the solder is melting. So that's actually going onto the tip now. And then when you want to apply it, so you got a little bit of solder on the tip, which is mean tinning the tip. Now we want to tin this bit of wire. So we'll just go over here and with the solder connected to the wire, just apply it like this. You see that how the solder's just gone across the top there? Now there's a chance it's gone all the way through, but quite often it doesn't. So you just check on the bottom and you see that the bottom doesn't have any solder on it yet. So we'll do the same thing. Do like that. And then quite often when you hold it a bit longer, it will heat up enough so it travels all the way through. So you just turn it all the way around, make sure it's all coated, and that one is. And we're ready to do the second one. So exactly the same thing. So we'll just tin it by putting on some solder. Like that. Just check it. Hasn't gone all the way through, so we'll do the back as well. Okay, we'll have a quick look all the way around. See how it's a little bit shiny, and that shows that it's solder all the way around. Okay, so we're ready to join those two bits together. Now let's just clean that off a bit. Alright, so what we want to do here is we don't need a lot of solder because we already tinned these two ends. We just need a little bit of solder on the end here, which will transfer the heat, and this will melt the solder that's already there and join them together. Okay, so hold this here. Sometimes it's easier to have like an extra clamp, but I'll see if I'm skilled enough just to solder these together as is. Okay, so you saw that how the solder melted both sides. Okay, and that's joined, and it's joined on the other side as well. Okay, clean that off. So let me hold it up and see if you can get a sort of closer look at it. All right, so that's really strong now. So if I'm pulling both sides, that's as strong as it was, or probably stronger than the original. Simple as that. Okay, and then to finish off that join, we'll just get some heat shrink. So I'll find a suitable size. So you might notice that heat shrink comes in different sizes. There's plenty in between as well. So you see those there. So when you select your heat shrink, it's going to halve its size. So if you have a look, this one's just about right. You want to cut the heat shrink so it's just a little bit bigger than your join, so you don't get anything coming out. Just give it a quick trim here. Okay, so you see that? A little bit longer. And then we're just going to slide this over one end and cover it. So just like that. Now just say for instance that both of these sides were already connected to something, well the heat shrink you'll need to put it on before you join it together. So from there you can either use a lighter, but I'm just going to use a heat gun. It's going to be a bit safer. And then we'll just shrink it down. And I won't be saying anything because it's going to be pretty loud, but I'll be rotating this and just making sure that it shrinks over and is tight. Alright, so that's shrunk. And you'll see how it's gripped onto the parts here. And where you see it's a little bit tighter in the center, that's good, because that means that when this cools down, it's not going to slide around, and that's what you want. Okay, so that's going to stay put. It's covered up all your bare wire, and there's not going to be any chances of a short circuit happening there. So all in all, that's the basics of soldering. Okay, so we'll be doing a similar thing to the other lengths of or thicknesses of wire. So let's just do this one and I'll quickly show you how we do something like this. So I'll do the same thing. I'll give it a bit of a chop. All right, again, we're going to clean off this insulation. So insulation is a little bit different. This one's a little bit stronger because this one's on a motor. This one's actually got fiber reinforcing. Okay, so that took a little bit more to cut off, but you can still see here. So the wire is quite thick. Now this one, let's see, do the same thing here. It needs a bit more cutting. Okay, so you see how this wire is quite a lot heavier than the first wire I did. Let's just move some of this out of the way so it's easier to see. Now the technique is the same, it just means that you're going to need to hold the soldering iron there longer so that the heat can transfer and that the solder can go inside. Okay, let's do this again. Alright, so we're going to tin the wire. So a bit of solder on the tip. That will help transfer the heat, and then apply this onto the end. Now you notice that if I pick it up, it hasn't really picked up any solder. That's because the heat hasn't been able to transfer. Now the heat of the iron needs to be transferred into the wire before the solder will want to stick. And it can take a bit longer because it takes time for this wire to get hot. So you see I've got a little ball there now, but it's going to take quite a lot more effort. Right, let's see, have an eye, bit of a look. Alright, not too successful yet. Needs a bit more heat. More solder. Oh, it's getting a bit hot now. I think I'm going to have to hold that with something. Alright, so that's where the needle nose pliers come in handy, because the heat is transferring all the way through to the wire. Alright, so that's going to stop me from getting burnt now. This one's really tough. Alright, so I've got a little bit on the end. This particular wire is being very, very difficult. I've got a feeling that this is oxidized, which means it doesn't want to stick. Right, that's not too happy. That's going to be the same, I think. No, it's not too happy. Okay, in that case that wasn't a very good example, because occasionally you will come across wire. Now this is wire that we've had hanging around for a little bit and it appears to be oxidized. What happens is wire does oxidize over time and it gets to a point where solder doesn't stick at all. So you'll notice that I've been able to get a little bit of wire to take the solder, but this is actually basically what I'll call gone off. Okay, so although that wasn't intentional, that gives a good example of bad wire. So if you do see something that happens like this, it's best to replace the wire entirely. Okay, so let's get rid of these little balls of solder. All right, let's go on to this thicker bit then. All right, so this thicker bit, I'll just clear off the insulation like I did on the previous examples. Now this one's a bit different because, as you can see, this is a heavy multi-strand wire. You can see there. So the idea behind this is it can have a lot more power travel through it, through each strand. Okay, so we'll just straighten it up like that. All right, so we'll do the same thing. Let's just get our solder out. All right, let's clean that tip. Okay, a bit of solder here. Now this might take a bit of effort too, because take time for the heat to travel through all this wire. But you can already see how it's sticking much better than the previous one. Okay, so I've got one end. Now what you find is with these heavier wires, you'll probably need to rotate this quite often, just to get to every single part until it heats up. Okay, and so this is the type of wire you'll commonly find on radio control cars. Alright, so that's pretty much all the way around. The tip, can't really see. Oh yep, tip needs a bit more. So just hold this over the thicker end of the tip of the soldering iron to transfer more heat. I can feel it coming up into my fingers, so it is transferring pretty well. Alright, so let's have a look at that ball of solder. It's not quite where I want it, because you'll see in the middle that that's still dry. So we'd like to have the solder going all the way through to give a nice strong joint. Just keep that going. And just keep feeding in a little bit of solder so I can suck it all the way in. Alright, I think that looks pretty good now. Alright, so I've got a really nice ball of solder on that. That'll be all the way through. And let's try soldering it onto a plug. Alright, so here's a plug I've had before. This one actually had wire that was on it, which I've just taken off. So it's already been tinned. If that was a brand new plug, then we'll need to put the solder on it like that to tin it, ready for a fresh wire to be soldered on. Okay, so I've got my little holder here, which can be handy. So some of these holders, they have various holes and also plug outlets, so that when you slide it in, you don't need any special tools like these pliers for holding it in place. And then we'll just pop it like that. So we'll solder onto this top section. So I'll need that because that's still really hot. Okay, let's just move my solder a bit closer. All right, so we're going to, let's just shift that over there for a bit more room. All right, so if I heated this up, you'll see the soldering's all melting there. So you see that, that's all fully tinned. I'll put this on here and we'll just apply heat until the heat goes all the way through and melts the solder that's on the plug itself, and then it'll be fully attached. So just you need to be careful to watch it as it melts. Let's have a look if that's done. Oh, it's still hot. Okay, now that's joined. Okay, as simple as that. Okay, so you see how the solder from both ends that were tinned already, with a little bit on the soldering iron, it's heated all the way through and it's attached itself. So if I just release that, that's still really hot. So gotta be careful there. Okay, so you see how that's all soldered on. Now, of course, if I had a longer wire, it would be helpful if we want to put heat shrink on this. So heat shrink we would normally put on the other side, and then when that's set, we'll slide it over the top and then heat shrink it on. But unfortunately, I've chosen too small a wire to show you how to do that. But that is the demonstration on how to solder. So you see how there was some slight different techniques. So with thinner wire, you work quicker, so you don't melt the insulation. With medium one, unfortunately I couldn't show you very well, but that was a good example of bad quality wire that's been oxidized and solder won't stick. So if you do see that, then that needs a wire replacement. Now this one here is a demonstration on how to do a very heavy gauge wire. So it takes a bit more time. You just need the point where both areas of the heavy metal is heated up to a point where the solder will melt and travel between the two joining parts. And then when it cools down, rock solid, like so. Okay, so that's my demonstration and tutorial on basic soldering. So thin wire, which you often find in railway sets or in doing modeling for lights or little motors, and then heavier gauge for doing radio control. So there you go. It's not that hard after all.